think I'll go ahead and get started. I know that we've got a lot to get through. Hopefully, we have some others that are just a little bit delayed in accessing today's call, and they'll be joining us soon. But yeah, in the interest of time, let's go ahead and get going with this. So thanks to those of you who have been able to join. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. And thanks for joining us for a presentation and discussion today of findings from the recurrent monitoring surveys carried out as part of RIO's Northeast Nigeria Resilience Research. My name is Tom Spangler, and I work with Save the Children as the Activity Director for the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning, or REAL activity. As I know everyone here knows, RMS are intended to help both policymakers and practitioners track important changes at the ground level and inform adaptations to program design and implementation. Obviously, in a context as complex and dynamic as Northeast Nigeria, this is both a critical and inherently difficult task. We're excited to share Tango's analysis with you, and we look forward to your questions and thoughts on the implications of these preliminary findings for your own work. We'll be breaking up this presentation with time for question and discussion. And during these times, please feel free to raise your hand or ask your questions directly. You can also pose your questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time. So again, we're very thankful for those of you who have made time today. We encourage your active participation. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself using the chat function. And with that, I'm happy to pass it over to Jazmian Ohanyere to offer a few opening remarks. And I think most will know that Jazmian serves as the Feed the Future team lead in the Office of Economic Growth and Environment for USAID Nigeria. Over to you, Jazmian.
Thank you so much, Tom, and great morning to those stateside and great afternoon to those here in Nigeria or in other places. I just want to express my gratitude to Tango's team for giving me the opportunity to provide brief remarks as we gather to observe the resilience evaluation, analysis, and learning real results for round 4 of this study. As the Feed the Future team lead, I recognize the importance of this evaluation for our current and future programming here in Nigeria. The analysis delves into our resilience interventions and has instrumentally helped us learn and adapt our current interventions and develop new resilience activities to inform our strategies, which aim to mitigate negative impacts of shocks and stresses and address humanitarian needs and improve well-being amidst a climate-driven crisis.
I spoke with her this morning. She was at work at the.
All right. So last week, I had the wonderful pleasure of visiting Gombe State, hosted by the Rural Resilience Activity. And I was profoundly impressed by the government's unwavering dedication to establish a secure haven for IDPs where they are not ostracized. And it fostering an overall development in the Northeast region. It was a pivotal highlight from the visit for me was the industrial park. It was a testament of Gombe State's commitment to economic growth. The industrial park, it was equipped with hydropower, modern roads, and an abundance of water supply in order to serve prospective and potential investors keen on contributing to the state's economic prosperity. The government's proactive approach in creating such an infrastructure demonstrates a strategic vision to propel the region forward. This initiative not only fosters economic development, but it also generates employment opportunities, income, and lays the foundation for a thriving economy. Witnessing this firsthand, witnessing firsthand the efforts invested in transforming Gombe State and the border and the broader Northeast, it is evident that the government is taking significant steps to create a conducive environment for sustainable growth. The strides made in infrastructure development and commitment to attracting investments speaks volumes about their dedication to shape a brighter future for the region. Overall, my experience in Gombe State left me impressed by the government's proactive stance towards fostering economic vitality and improving the lives of its residents. Now, as we approach our final stages of our new 2024 to 2029 Global Food Security Strategy Plan here in Nigeria, we aim to demonstrate our ability to manage a complex and compounding risk environment. Our approach involves leveraging networks through development, diplomacy, interagency, and government partners, the private sector engagement, and inclusive development. This concerted effort aims to maximize sustainable impacts and advance the well-being of Nigerians in the fight against hunger, poverty, and malnutrition. Tango's evaluation will provide a valuable insight to address Nigeria's challenging risk environment. Climate risks such as devastating floods, persistent droughts, coupled with internal and external factors such as the Russian invasion on Ukraine and the governmental transition, amplify domestic challenges ranging from currency crisis to fuel, fertilizer, and food availability. While new shocks will inevitably emerge, this evaluation will aim in strengthening our preparativeness and response. Anticipating, and to go back to our strategy, we're anticipating our new strategy be launched the beginning of next year as we stay committed to advancing food security in Nigeria. Lastly, I express my gratitude to each participant for their valuable contribution and constructive feedback during this evaluation process. It has shaped and enhanced and strengthened this evaluation. Your engagement has been instrumental in ensuring the quality and depth of this assessment. Thank you all for your active involvement. And finally, I eagerly anticipate the insight from this evaluation, and it will further our collaboration in creating better livelihoods here in Nigeria. Thank you. Thank you so much. Over to you, Karyn.
Hey, Jazmian, thank you so much for your words, for grounding us in your recent trip to Gombe, and also setting more of the policy and strategy level stage as well. It really provides the context for the work that we've all been doing. And, first, I just really want to echo your sentiment about, with thanks to partners who have been with us on this journey and committed their time and insights from the very beginning. In particular to you, Jazmian, and your colleagues at the Nigeria Mission, to our colleagues at the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security, REAL, and most importantly, our colleagues at the Rural Resilience Activity who have committed countless hours of time for the last year and a half to see this RMS through, as well as our research partners on the ground, Binomial Optimist Limited. Couldn't have done this without all of you. So thank you. And with that, again, my name is Karyn Fox. I'm the Senior Research Advisor for Tango International and a lead on this Nigeria study. And it's just been my privilege to work with all of you on this over the last many, many months. So thank you. So with that, we'll just jump right into the next slide. I'll give a quick overview of our time together today. We'll start with just a very quick refresh. I know most of you have been, as I said, with us on this journey from the beginning, so we want to try to get right into the heart of it. So after that, I'm going to provide just a very brief high-level summary of some of our key findings, preliminary findings. We're going to jump right in. And all of those findings that I share with you, we'll have some time to unpack during the course of the presentation. We'll give a quick just reminder about what it is that we're looking at in terms of the targeted market systems development practices that rural resilience activity is implementing in the Northeast. Again, quick overview of the methodology, and then again, jump in to spend the bulk of our time on the findings with ample time for discussion, because we really want to hear your reflections on what we share today. So to start with the questions, essentially what this study is looking at, as I think you know, is really in fragile context. What are the market systems intervention sets that can contribute to increased resilience capacities over time? And which of those capacities in turn enable households and communities to better mitigate and recover from shocks and stresses, as well as improve their well-being outcomes over time? You'll note in this particular graph, shock exposure right up front, but also throughout, because what we're looking at, as you all know, is a very dynamic and very intense shock context, which plays into all of the findings that we'll share with you today. Yeah, next slide. So again, like I said, just jumping right in. Want to start with the first finding in response to kind of the key question here, right? Have households in the rural resilience area program areas, have they grown more resilient over time? That's kind of the crux of what we're trying to look at here. And what we found is that resilience capacities have remained about the same or even improved, particularly with respect to absorptive capacity. And this is important, again, thinking back to the shock context, it's been persistent insecurity, displacement, and importantly, the macroeconomic conditions that have really affected people's ability to cope over time. So to have this finding in light of those conditions is certainly a takeaway. So then our next question is, well, given that, what are the interventions that help to enhance or protect resilience capacities? Our preliminary analysis has found that some of the core targeted market systems interventions have contributed to enhanced, in particular, absorptive resilience capacities for some households. The things that really jump out from the analysis are around our collective or group formation. So those community farmer and market producer groups, savings and loan groups, which really provide a platform whereby rural resilience activity, government, and other actors can engage in promoting those market system services. So the next question we ask is, how do those targeted market services and production practices enhance resilience capacities? And so again, we found that households that belong to producer groups or savings groups at any round during the course of this study over the last year had higher livelihood diversification. And they also had greater access to training, financial services, social and psychosocial support among members. We see that livelihood diversification in the last round of the study was associated with higher asset ownership and a greater likelihood of saving in round 4, which we know to be very key components of resilience capacities. In addition, the use of financial services and notably improved storage practices in this context also proved to be very vital. From our qualitative data in particular, we found that the extent to which households had increased capacity to diversify and expand livelihoods enabled them to better share and exchange support. And particularly in this high inflationary context, having access to stored tangible goods was borne out as a really important component. So our next question is, to what extent does the layering of the various interventions have an effect on resilience capacities? And again, looking back at our core groups, our production groups and our VSLA groups, we found that through those platforms, households that use a combination of RRA market services and practices over the course of the RMS had higher resilience capacities in round 4. So this suggests that there is certainly something to this layering component of the market systems development activity. It was particularly important for households that use 5 or more categories of these services. And here we provide, or here, you can see what those, core services are in membership and producer groups and BSLAs, and then use of very specific types of services in this context. Vet livestock services, improved storage bags and containers, and then finally, something that we know RRA is very targeted, developing greater linkages with output market actors, in particular aggregators and off-takers. So our next question, do strengthened resilience capacities enable households to better mitigate or recover from shocks and stresses? Here we find that households that saved cash, owned productive and household assets, and used improved practices were ultimately more likely to be food secure. They were more likely to be confident about their ability to cope, and they were also better able to meet their food needs after a shock. Next slide. So what factors enable households to participate in resilience programming? This is something we'd like to come back to in our discussion with you, because the data showed that those households that entered this study with greater asset levels also had higher resilience capacities at the end of the study, and they're more likely to engage in market systems interventions. So finally, another key aspect of our study is looking at the layering of the market system development component together with humanitarian assistance. And here we find that households that did receive cash assistance during this very high inflation period were also more likely to be food secure. We're less likely to be food insecure than households that did not receive cash assistance. And we know that early on in this program, I think closed by April of 2022, RRA had rolled out a $15 million COVID-19 cash response. We saw the effects of that, particularly in our initial assessment in April, and again in RMS round one in August of last year. And we saw the effects of that very strongly up front. And then a bit, as we were collecting data for this round in August of 23, RRA was rolling out another cash transfer for the Ukraine response. So we weren't able to necessarily see a lot of the effects of that, but certainly the data picked up some access to cash and the extent to which people were able to use that to get by. And, again, earlier on, that cash was more likely to be used for investing in business and livelihood diversification and scaling up business activities. So next slide. So yeah, with that, just overview. Again, we're going to get into the details of these things and unpack that, but I want to pass it over to my colleague, Gheda Temsah, Senior Research Scientist with Tango International, and our lead quantitative analyst on this study. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Karyn. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We'll start with a brief refresh of the rural resilience activity. As we all know, the activity operates in the states of Borno, Adamawa, Yobe, and Gombe, and it uses a market systems development approach, in which it works with a variety of market actors to both stimulate the growth of market systems and diverse economic opportunities, what we would call pull activities, and also engages in support for push activities to build capacity for various market actors to take advantage of these opportunities. The program targets specific commodities that are known to be, that were identified early on as commonly cultivated crops or raised livestock, and those include cowpea, groundnut, maize, rice, as well as the raising of small ruminants. The targeted beneficiaries include farmer households, as well as micro and small medium enterprises. Integrated with these market system activities are peace building and short-term humanitarian assistance. Here we have an overview of the various categories of market services and production practices that RRA is promoting through its market system actors or partners. We'll come back to these in more detail in the coming slides, but very quickly, those broadly, the 7 categories include the microfinance and credit groups, VSLAs, producer groups, financial services, output market services, input market services, and the use of improved technology and practices, as well as training, although noting that just the facilitative nature of the program, the training is provided indirectly through the market actors or partners. In terms of methodology, the RMS is comprised of a quantitative and qualitative component. The quantitative component uses a panel multi-stage cluster design where we surveyed households across 34 clusters in 20 LGAs. We drew our sample from a list of about 206 communities in which RA is operating. These tended to be communities that were relatively more stable or had markets that were had the potential to thrive or recover. And so our sample is representative of the overall RA areas. It's worth noting that our sample does not include non-RA areas. So in the absence of a counterfactual, we're not able to make any attribution attribute any of the changes we observed to the program itself. The survey includes quantitative component includes household and community questionnaires. The household questionnaires tended to be streamlined for the interim rounds, and we conducted the community questionnaires in rounds 1 and 4. The qualitative component included a combination of key informant interviews and focus group discussions. The sample was purposefully selected, a total of 12 communities from among the quantitative sample, with a view to ensuring a mix of value chains, interventions, receipt of cash transfers, as well as displacement characteristics. The table to the right gives you an overview of the timing of the various rounds and the sample sizes. And it's worth noting that round 1, which took place in August 2022, overlapped with the lean season. The round 2 overlapped with the main harvest period. Round 3 overlapped with the tail end of the main harvest period and a time of land preparation. And round 4 was timed to overlap with round 1 and coincides with the lean period or lean season. Our results today represent analysis that was conducted using data across all 4 rounds. We wanted to take advantage of the panel nature of the data to be able to talk about change over time and the association between interventions and resilience and well-being. And so, while we acknowledge that the associations are not conclusively cause and effect, we believe that by comparing round 4 outcomes with earlier measures of participation, we're able to mitigate some of the potential effects of simultaneity. And this also gives us more confidence in the directionality of the relationship. And in addition to our multivariate panel analyses, we conducted statistical comparisons of key indicators over time. And we use that as a background analysis to be able to assess trends as we have been, and also describe the context. And throughout this process, we integrated the qualitative results and really looked to the qualitative data for not just to triangulate, but also to contextualize the survey results and to highlight any findings that weren't necessarily coming across in the survey data. I think we've all become accustomed to this timeline, which illustrates or overlays the schedule of various different data collection against some of the macro shocks. And we can come back to this if there are any questions. I'd like to move over and discuss the findings. And I'd like to really group these findings around the key questions that Karyn raised earlier, noting that any findings we discuss tend to be, we're reporting statistically significant findings at the 0.05 level. So this first set of questions or analyses was around, have households grown more resilient over time? And what we learned is that average absorptive resilience capacity, which is a measure of the ability of households to absorb or deal with a shock, remained stable between round 1 and 4. So that's about a score of 38 on a scale of 0 to 100. On the other hand, the average adaptive resilience capacity, which is measuring here the ability of households to proactively make informed decisions to be able to mitigate the effects of future shocks, declined, went down from about 39 in round 1 to 35 in round 4. Similarly, we saw a decline in the transformative resilience capacity, and that's really tapping into those system level resources such as infrastructure, market conditions, and services that impact households' abilities to respond to shocks and crises and stresses. And we saw there a decline as well from a average score of about 56 in round 1 to about 41 in round 4. But it's worth noting that these overall averages mask differences among households. And indeed, as Karyn pointed out earlier, some households' resilience capacities remained about the same or improved despite this ongoing and compounded effects of conflict, displacement, security, and economic challenges. So in this context, we wanted to be able to say something about which interventions help protect or enhance households' resilience capacities. And to address this question, we conducted several multivariate analyses where we looked at absorptive resilience capacity and adaptive resilience capacity at round 4, and looked at those as a function of households' use of these various different categories of market services and practices that RA is promoting, while also controlling for shock exposure and other confounding variables that could both impact households' likelihood of tapping into those market services and using improved practices, as well as their resilience. And what we found is that households that use the following interventions at any point during the RMS had a higher absorptive resilience in round 4. And as you can see, the figure to the right illustrates, and just to recap what those interventions are, or buckets of interventions, they would be those community-based groups, the community-based VSLAs, community-based producer marketing groups, and the use of improved storage. And what the figure to the right here illustrates is if we compare households that use those practices to those to the frame of reference here is that vertical blue line at 35.2, which indicates what would be the average absorptive capacity score for households. We can see that all these dots align to the right of the line, which indicate a higher score for households using these particular intervention categories. We also wanted to explore whether there was any benefit to layering. And in other words, whether combining different categories of the program targeted services across the 4 rounds of the RMS, whether that was associated with higher resilience in round 4. And to recap here, the blue box below illustrates what those 7 categories are. And what we found was that households that combined services or practices from 5 or more categories at any point during the RMS cycle had higher absorptive capacity in round 4 than those who used 4 categories. And to just to provide a little more insight there. So for example, those that used 5 categories, their absorptive resilience capacity was 13% higher in round 4 than those who didn't. For 6 categories, it was 18%. 7 categories, was 31%. And we also found in terms of adaptive resilience capacities, that households that combined services and practices across all 7 categories had higher adaptive capacities in round 4 compared to those who didn't. And more so here, we also found that using fewer than 4, so specifically just 1 or 2, actually had lower adaptive capacities in round 4. And just as a frame of reference here, we use the 4 categories as the reference point because that represents, in general, the average number of categories used across the board by all households. And excuse me. So we wanted to get a little more granular here and identify specific interventions within those categories that households were using. And so we looked at households that are in that were using 5 or more categories, if you will, those higher resilience households. And we found that the most common individual interventions that they participated in were, again, membership in VSLAs, participation in producer marketing groups or farmer co-ops. They tended to use vet livestock services, improved storage practices, and tended to be linked with output market actors such as aggregators and off-takers. In addition to identifying the interventions that were associated with improved resilience over time, we wanted to get a better understanding of how those interventions were contributing to improved resilience. And to do that, we looked at the key components of absorptive and adaptive resilience capacities, which are asset ownership, livelihood diversification, savings, and social capital. And what we found looking at the quantitative data is that belonging to a VSLA or a community-based producer or marketing group at any point during the RMS was associated with greater livelihood diversification in round 4, which, as mentioned, is a key component of adaptive resilience capacity. And although the analysis did not indicate a direct relationship between the program targeted services and assets or savings, what we found was that livelihood diversification in round 3 was associated with higher assets and the likelihood of saving in round 4. And these are key components of resilience capacities. And conversely, it's worth stating that we conducted additional analyses and found that asset ownership in earlier rounds was not associated with livelihood diversification in round 4, which suggests to us that the direction of the causality here is that the livelihood diversity is enhancing asset ownership over time. In this vein of trying to understand better the how question, how do these interventions contribute to enhanced resilience? We turn to the qualitative data and interviews for insights. And the interviews with the focus group discussions and key interviews highlighted some of the ways in which the benefits of belonging to VSLAs or producer groups. Respondents across the board appreciated VSLAs, underscoring their accessibility, their familiarity, and reliability. And one of the ways in which participation in VSLAs facilitated livelihood diversification was simply being able to access loans, which in this context, where it's difficult to access cash, it's difficult to take out loans, perhaps also some of the areas may be remote or, as we know, are underserviced by formal providers, being able to have a platform where these farmer households or small business owners know that they can borrow money to diversify their livelihoods and make investments in small businesses and farming is one of the ways that this, one of the benefits of being in a VSLA. So just to give a couple of small examples here, we saw in the data that borrowing from VSLAs allowed households to start small businesses such as water sales, detergent, cooked food sales, tailoring, and manure sales. And we also observed or learned from the interviews that it allowed former non-farmers, specifically, for example, cab or motorcycle drivers, to take on farming for market sales. And also, we learned that loans from the VSLAs were instrumental in allowing certain groups, particularly women and the elderly, to take on livestock rearing of goats and poultry in specific. In addition to providing a platform to access loans. These community groups also were a place for training, where farmer households and others, other members could learn about improved practices. And the qualitative study participants reported that as a result of this training, there was better use of loans. They were able to adopt better financial strategies and business practices. And this was particularly noted among women and youth. It was also noted by focus group discussants that the improved production practices that they received training on in the context of these producer groups and VSLAs led to increased yields and income. So really this combination of training and financial services was quite strategic. There are also other benefits to participating in the VSLAs that then allow for greater livelihood diversification. One, they serve as a point of distribution for inputs. They're also a place for a mechanism for collective grain storage. And they also allow for mutual support, collective problem solving, and collective action. We were able to identify as well and wanted to identify some of the challenges to belonging to VSLAs, and increasingly financial hardship constrains the ability to make contributions, and those who make contributions are more likely to access loans. It was noted also the inflated transportation costs were a major barrier to participation, and particularly for providers of training to travel out and to train members. This next bucket of findings is focused on that second piece of the overarching research question, which is how do resilience capacities contribute to enable households to mitigate or recover from shocks and stresses. And here we looked at food security, coping, and recovery. This figure overlays the prevalence of food insecurity, illustrated with the orange bar columns, with the price inflation or inflationary shocks. As you can see, severe food insecurity increased from about 60% to almost 80% from round 1 to round 4. This increase in food insecurity can be understood in the broader context here. We know that more than 50% of households experienced human disease and increased food prices in round 4. And it is also notable, as indicated by the lines, the orange dotted line, the blue and gray line, that the percent of households experiencing price-related shocks also increased from round 1 to round 4, underscoring the worsening economic conditions. In terms of coping with shocks and stresses, if you recall in prior rounds, specifically round 1 and round 2, the common coping strategies included reducing food consumption, modifying diets, and borrowing from friends and family. But what we observed over time is that the reliance on these coping strategies declined as households moved to more extreme methods, particularly in round 3, which is illustrated in the graph on the right. You can see that those extreme methods, such as sending children to work for money, migrating family members, selling productive assets, and marrying off daughters, peaked in round 3 and remained at relatively higher levels in round 4. And this also underscores, again, the severity of conditions. In terms of confidence to cope with a severe shock, our data show that households' confidence declined from round 1 to round 4. That is illustrated. We can see the downward sloping blue line shows a decline in confidence. And we see also an increase in households who are not confident. That's the orange line that dips and then goes back up in round 4. Households were asked about the extent to which they were able to recover from shocks and stresses, and that's understood as the extent to which they were able to meet their food needs post-shock. And here again, we see an increase in the households who believe that their ability to meet their food needs was worse than before the shock or cumulative shocks they had experienced. And that's illustrated in the orange line, with the orange line. We also saw a decline in households who perceived that their ability to meet their food needs was the same as before the shock. And that is illustrated with the gray line. Again here, in order to explore the association between enhanced resilience and household well-being, we conducted multivariate analyses, and we looked at combined the data across the 4 rounds. And what we found is that households that saved cash, used improved production practices at any point in the cycle of the RMS, were less likely to be severely food insecure compared to households that did not. We also found that households that received cash aid were less likely to be food insecure. The qualitative study underscores the gratitude that participants and the appreciation they had for the cash transfers, and enabled them to be able to purchase food, invest in their livelihoods, and to pay off their debts. We also found that households that saved cash regularly and had household assets were more likely to be confident about their ability to cope with severe shocks compared to those who do not. And here we also found bridging social capital, which is a key component of resilience, was also associated with confidence to cope with shocks. The results of our multivariate analysis indicated that internally displaced households were more likely to be confident about their ability to cope than non-IDPs, and this is controlling for the household characteristics and other confounders. And what we learned from the qualitative data is that IDPs, or some of the IDPs, were in this unique position that in addition to the land that they were able to rent and farm in their host communities, as they had access to their ancestral lands, and with the relative stabilization in certain areas, some of these IDPs are able to go back and farm that land. And so they're able to have that kind of dual advantage. We also know from the qualitative data that IDPs have been really innovative and resourceful, and able to access and create livelihood opportunities for themselves and their host communities, as well as sharing their knowledge and skills. In terms of the recovery, what we found again here, the theme of the importance of assets and improved production practices, that households with productive assets and who used at least one form of improved production practice were more likely to believe that their ability to meet their food needs was better than before the shock, or at least did not worsen, meaning it was the same. And again, here we see the theme of social capital as being was associated with the ability to meet food needs better than before the shock. So looking to the qualitative data, we had some insights as to better understand really the role of asset ownership. And the focus group discussions highlighted livestock as a critical asset. They're a common investment, and they're provide a form of savings in this high inflation context. So typically households purchase livestock as a livelihood risk diversification strategy. For example, to complement their transportation business or their small business, or if they or farming livelihood. And as noted earlier, women, elderly, and other individuals with limited mobility or the need to stay within the homestead commonly manage livestock as a way to supplement their income. And ownership of having a stock of livestock also was handy. In addition to that, the productive assets as well were used as a coping strategy to deal with shocks and stresses. And we noted that in rounds 3 and round 4. So just to have that as a backup. We also learned from the quantitative data that households that used market services and improved production practices at any point during the RMS typically started out with greater assets. And this for us underscored the importance of assets in shaping access to who gets to tap into or make use of existing market services and to implement improved production practices. And this is something we can come back to. I know Karyn will come back to with the programming implications. Qualitative data underscored the importance of social capital, consistent with our findings, with the survey findings. For households that had a successful harvest and were able to store their farm produce and sell it again were more likely to share and support neighbors. And households supported each other in times of need in different ways other than sharing food. They tended to help each other with farm work. They would travel together, work together on the farms, help to clear drainage and rebuild homes and roads due to flooding, and tended to come together in solidarity for important occasions like birthdays and funerals. But what we also know from the qualitative data is that in this context of extreme hardship, sharing, it's become harder for households to share, even though the quantitative data doesn't necessarily indicate any change in social capital indices scores. This is coming across in the qualitative data. For example, households increasingly substituted in-person gatherings with letters and phone calls because of the high transport costs. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Karyn, for a discussion of the programming implications.
Great,
Over.
thank you. Oh, thank you, Gheda. And it's a lot of information to take in. So before we jump into sharing with you some of the conclusions or takeaways that we have after this analysis, I wanted just to pause for a moment. I know we have a couple of questions that have come out in the chat box, or sorry, in the Q&A, but just take a moment here to pause. And if you're listening and you have a question you'd like to offer at this time, feel free to raise your hand, unmute, or put that question into the chat box. Our first question here was from Dan Hedner, Technical Market Systems Advisor from Mercy Corps on the rural resilience activity. And Dan asks, do we have any categories of interventions? I know, Mark, you jumped in on the chat to answer this. Would you like to join the conversation?
Yeah, sure. Yes. Dan, yeah, we have the detailed information about participation in categories of interventions and down to the level of individual interventions. That information is available. Over.
Well, thank you, Mark. Any other questions before we get into a discussion of considerations for programming?
Hi, Karyn. It looks like there's a question from John in the Q&A.
Yes, John Meyer, thank you. Is participation in rural resilience activities voluntary? And thank you to John Rakchara, our Chief of Party for the rural resilience activity, for responding to that question. Again, John, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So, like Gheda said, we have two approaches to the work. One where we are using the pull approach, really capitalizing on the opportunities that market actors create to kind of like hook households into the Northeast to engage in market opportunities. But then there are also instances where we are using our push interventions to identify those traditionally, people who could be left out from the marketplace, and we also go after them. Whoever is a set of selection criteria that helps us to identify women, youth, IDPs, and persons with disabilities, and also marginalized communities, and we go after them to engage them. So the response was that we use both approach. There are instances where people voluntarily, find themselves to engage, and also the instances where we go after them to help them take advantage of market opportunities. Thank you, Anava.
Thanks,
Thank you,
John.
John. Oh, sorry, go ahead, John.
Just expressing my thanks as well. Thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a nice segue into, again, some of these considerations that we really want to put out to you and have a discussion on in the time that remains. So again, one of the first big takeaways for us in this analysis that we would like to share with you and hear your thoughts on is that in Northeast Nigeria, in the RRA targeted areas, it was really interventions that enhanced livelihood diversification and also protected social capital and fostered social capital as key pathways to supporting resilience capacities and household well-being. Those interventions that help to protect critical and productive assets, very, very essential. I think what's very much stands out in the data as well is that the use of an integrated and complementary programming approach around these market systems development interventions is key. So having a suite of interventions that households and communities can draw upon is critical. And being able to target those interventions through these collective platforms, the farmer groups, savings groups, producer groups, that's really where we saw the layering of these complementary programming activities. Strengthening financial services, strengthening linkages, and also, again, the training component, which we picked up quite strongly in the qualitative data. And this training, as Gheda mentioned earlier, comes through RRA's partners in the field. And that training seemed to happen both informally and formally. So it was those interactions with your seed supplier, interactions with your fertilizer supplier. And what we saw in the qualitative data in particular was real improvements that people had initiated and undertaken as a result of guidance and advice recommendations that was coming through these service providers around seed spacing, around reduced fertilizer use, et cetera. And then, as I think Gheda has highlighted throughout the data or throughout the presentation of the findings, the importance of really fostering that critical social capital that people relied on very much. We saw that jump out in rounds 3 and 4 when access to cash and access to other resources was limited. People came together and shared what they had. Those VSLAs continued to function in rounds 3 and 4, in some cases not as loan service providers, but as social and psychosocial support groups. The next slide, please. So this speaks to your comment, John. I think one of the other things that we've very much seen in the data was the extent to which these targeted cash assistance promoted investments, but also inclusive participation. During this context, over the last 6-8 months of a severe cash crisis and a loss of the fuel subsidy, it severely impacted both the supply and the demand side for services. People had limited transport to be able to access market services, to get to markets. And similarly, providers were challenged by the cost of transport to get out to the communities that they serve. Something else that came out quite strongly in the qualitative data in particular, I think Gheda touched on this, was the extent to which that cash assistance was coupled with these group formations, group activities, and provided training and access to services rather than as a standalone cash aid. Finally, I think the data shows how important it is to stimulate the supply of what we're describing as productivity enhancing services. And I think that's a very contextual finding currently in Northeast Nigeria. And I think, as Gheda mentioned, having those livestock assets was critical as an investment or as a form of savings, therefore leading to the increased demand for vet and livestock services. Similarly, it was the ability to store tangible grain and to be able to share that and to some extent market it. So the application of those improved post-harvest storage interventions was similarly critical, and provided people with a buffer during a real intensive shock experience. The next slide, please. Yeah. So with that, again, we put those considerations for programming out to you, and would welcome at this time your questions, your thoughts, and reflections on the findings and some potential programming implications. And I think, as Tom mentioned at the top of the hour, or the top of the half hour, do feel free to raise a hand or pop that question into the chat box. John, I see you, John Rachara. I see that you have a comment and question in the Q&A box. Please feel free to unmute.
Oh, hi, Karyn. Hey, this is Mark Langworthy from Tango. Yeah, I was just typing a response to John's comment and question, and yeah, thanks, John. This is a really helpful comment, and we will certainly look back into both our quantitative and qualitative information to look at to see what kind of information we can pull out about the types of animals that are being sold, to delve into this question. Thanks for this insight. Over.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thanks, Mark. And just to echo what Mark suggested, is your questions will help us to develop further analysis and further inquiry on the data that we have as we move forward in the study. So I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat or the Q&A box. Feel free to share what jumps out to you as significant from the findings.
Hey, Karyn.
John, please.
Yeah, thanks. One of our special interests in this study was always the relation to conflict and insecurity. And I'm curious if the researchers could expound any more on, using a market-based approach in conflict-affected areas. What did the study reveal, if anything, about what works and what doesn't? What affects the insecurity had on market activities, et cetera? Did we gain any additional insights there that you all would like to share? Over.
John, thank you for asking that question. I think you noticed what's not in our slides, and that was an extensive discussion around conflict and insecurity. And going back to your opening remarks, Jazmian, about the commitment in this region to providing security. To respond to your question, I want to turn first to Gheda and then over to our colleague Charles Maish on the qualitative team to share some of the insights we have from not just round 4 data set, but changes that we observed over time. So, Gheda?
Thanks, Karyn. And thanks, John. That's a great question. And we have on our to-do list to look further into the data coming out of the community survey, which we conducted in round 1 and round 4. And there we collected information on access to market services, and also in round 4, we included some questions around if there were disruptions, then what were the nature of this disruptions, which of course conflict and insecurity is among the potential response categories. So we're going to look at that more closely from the quantitative side and roll that into the final report.
Well, thanks, Gheda. Charles, could you unmute and just share some of the insights from the qualitative findings? Oh, and Mark, I see your hand up as well. So
Sure.
Charles?
Yes, I'll jump in briefly here. Thank you. Yes, this conflict component is something that we have been looking into. There has been perhaps less of a finding, but we have been looking into the mention of insecurity. This came across fairly prominently in the initial assessment on the first round, where kidnapping served as sort of a risk for particularly ag input suppliers of accessing some of these communities. As we continued through the different rounds, we did see a decrease in at least the mentions of particularly kidnapping or threats of theft on while delivering supplies. Another key area we're hoping to look more into is how insecurity impacts land access. In the first round and second, we saw that sometimes farmers were hesitant to access fields further away from the communities due to fear of theft. In round 4, we saw that the push for the need for land was pushing, for example, displaced populations returning to their ancestral homes to access the land that they have there. This was oftentimes during dry season farming. This is something that we'll look more into for the final report. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Well, thanks, Charles. Mark?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to actually raise another question that has come up in my mind around the security, and that's the fact that over the course of this RMS, in the later rounds in particular, the populations have been affected by these sort of economic and monetary shocks, and that's seems to have been quite those have had quite important effects. And one of the sort of questions that I have is that it seems that one of the things that we found is that the relative value of having real commodities, like having food stocks and improved storage, takes on increased value as these monetary shocks become more prevalent. But there's sort of a trade-off there, or I don't know if it's a trade-off, but a problem in the sense that the monetary shocks, sort of put increased value on households keeping real stocks of physical commodities. But on the other hand, that may be an increased risk in terms of exposure to conflict problems. So it's a question that has come into my mind that we will try and look at in more depth as well. Thanks. Over.
And it looks like we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box.
Well, thanks, Karina. First, Madeline Smith, feel free to unmute if you'd like to voice your question and comment. Otherwise, I'm happy to read it from the chat box. Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for the super interesting presentation. I'm very interested in just the connections between the cash transfers and the other activities. But I'm curious, and it may not actually be possible in this kind of conflict environment, but I'm actually really curious to know if you were able to look at kind of the extent that households could adopt, climate smart or, climate resilient practices, and really influence in a, kind of meaningful, scalable way, the natural resource environment that would also help them to withstand some of the environmental shocks. And maybe some of the dynamics around that would be very interesting to learn.
Thank you for those questions, both very, very interesting and relevant. Maybe Gheda or Mark, if you'd like to take this one.
Sure, Karyn. So we do collect information on the uptake of climate resilient practices. Those that were identified by RRA. We have stats on the prevalence of that, but we don't in this survey collect information on and how that's the environmental impacts that's having. So that's a very valid and important question, but we don't gather that information. I don't think that has come up in the qualitative data either, because they really our discussions were focused around that. But it's something I think to keep in mind for the future. I don't know, Mark or Charles, if you'd like to add to that. Over.
I agree with you, Gheda.
Yeah, thanks. It's an interesting question, and I think the qualitative data did to some extent show some climate smart type of activities with regard to seed selection, improved spacing, and interestingly, we saw a shift toward the use of kind of organic compost and manure as fertilizers, but that was primarily driven by the cash shortage and lack of access to fertilizers. So it's an interesting question. I think something we need to explore, we can explore more deeply. I think your second question, Madeline, referred to insights around this layering of cash transfers with other market systems development interventions. Again, another one of our kind of key takeaways. So I'm turning to the Tango team. If Gheda, Mark, Charles would like to respond.
Karyn, could you recap that, please?
And Madeline, correct me if I don't have the question correct, but I think your first comment referred to an interest in the way that cash transfers are working together with other types of market systems development interventions. If I got that right?
Yeah, I was basically kind of appreciating what you already shared. But you mentioned that it was more effective to combine the cash transfers with additional services. So I am interested to know, kind of what, level of support was given to the service side in order to make the linkage between kind of the push of the cash transfers, combined with the VSLA, and then any other kind of system level support that was provided to different groups or private service providers.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll let Charles jump in here. I just wanted to comment, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that we saw the effects of the cash transfers most prominently in the initial assessment from April, and then again round one of the RMS in August of last year. And that's where we had numerous accounts in the qualitative data in particular about people using those cash transfers to invest in new businesses, to buy processors for soy that they were producing, to expand their kind of market reach, expand the types of packaging or the kind of quality of produce and goods that they were taking to market. So it was to some extent using that cash in a way that then scaled up what RRA was already doing. I think by the time we get to round 4, the situation is quite different. One, the cash transfers were being rolled out at the time we were collecting the data. The scale was much smaller. 4 million, I believe. But we did see some evidence in the qualitative data. So, Charles, would you like to add to that in terms of what those transfers? Again, very limited information from the data set, but how those transfers may have been used differently in round 4.
Yes, thank you, Karyn. So we're referencing 2 cash transfers that RA rolled out. There's the COVID-19 one that happened last year. So we mostly captured that in round 1 in the initial assessment. And then in round 4, we have the Ukraine-Russia cash transfer, which is more targeted. It's slightly smaller because it was being rolled out actively in August during data collection. The mentions are few, but this one is specifically targeted towards improving the businesses and livelihoods of generally small business actors. And we expect to be seeing kind of similar investments in households expanding the livelihoods that they have because the cost of farm inputs has been a barrier consistently with the high inflation. Farmers oftentimes purchase fertilizer and seeds with the inputs. Other businesses choose to expand the inventory that they have. Thanks. Over.
Mark.
Yeah, I just wanted to also make the point that there's sort of two ways that cash transfers can support a market systems development strategy. One is really to support the demand side. A lot of these shocks, basically one of their negative impacts on the market system is to restrict the demand side of the food demand for food. And so cash transfers can help to support that the demand side. But there's also an important sort of supply side factor that our findings have pointed out as an important factor, and that is that we see that participation in the in the market systems development interventions tends to be the households or the market agents that have more assets that engage in that. So the cash transfers can also be thought of as a way to strengthen the sort of the supply side, that is providing cash for producers, small traders to be able to engage in their production and marketing activities. Over.
Thanks, Mark. And also thanks to you, John Rakchara, for jumping in with an offer or with a description of the types of specific climate smart interventions that RA is implementing.
Yes.
So I know we do have a couple of, sorry, John, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that we also are keen that we need to put up some interventions that tend to reinforce the transformative capacity. And that is why if you see what we have here, tend to really contribute to transformative capacities of the households and the communities and the market to climate shocks. So they are a little bit long term. I mean, like, the impacts or the outcomes of these tend to come slowly with time, and that is why we would like to engage actually also an external consultant to look at what the impacts of each of these interventions working together, what that means for the households in the northeast of Nigeria, and we're happy to share the data. Madeline, if that's helpful. Thank you.
Just jumping in real quick here to say one last point, that generally insurance was fairly low. We know that farmers were being introduced to insurance and educated on it, and there was some interest there. There was one positive example here in round 4 of farmers actually receiving a payout from one of the insurance schemes that RA introduced them to in this round for, where farmers were given some recompensation from the flooding that occurred. So that was one element, one positive story to share. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Charles. No, John, you mentioned the importance of this transformative capacity component, the slow moving variables. I'm wondering if Gheda or Mark, you'd like to is that something we've been talking about as well internally, about analysis for the transformative component? If you'd like to comment on that, and then we can turn to you, Nate.
Sorry, yeah, well, let me just jump in here quickly. I think that the impacts on the transformative capacity, sort of the higher systems level impacts, that's going to certainly be a major focus of our follow-up study that we will be designing and implementing to do in the coming year. The RMS, by its nature, because it's looking at sort of a short-term responses to shocks within a single year, we're less likely to really see major changes associated with the kinds of the participation that we're measuring in the RMS in terms of transformative capacities and systems level changes. But that's certainly going to be a major focus of what we look at in the follow-up study. Over.
Thanks, Mark. Oh, sorry, John?
Yes, I'm just, look, thanks, Karyn, Gheda, and Tim from Tango. I just have one burning issue for me. To the most part, we have looked a lot at, a savings group of ESLAs, etc., and how that reinforces the household resilience capacities. But there are also others that, for example, the relationship between demand and supply and ability of a household to participate in grain market. For us, we look at grain market as, a sure chance that money flows into an economy, and how those who actually participate in that market tends to accumulate resources that could be put then in savings or invested in other household assets, etc. It might be, and also one thing we also see is that the relationship and the behaviors in the grain markets tend to evolve over time as well. And this is an area we have made significant investments in trying to drive that behavior change. Maybe in your study, you would like to interrogate that a little bit further to see how those relationships are shifting, how the behaviors of demand and supply is actually changing, and whether there is a relationship between participation in the grain market and household resilience. Like I said, we see grains as an opportunity for money to flow into the economy where households participate. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, John. Mark, or would you care to respond?
Yeah, sure. I'll give my response. Yeah, thanks, John. I think that's helpful. We will. We have not yet done that in terms of focusing particularly on participants in grain markets. That's a follow-on analysis that we will certainly pursue. I guess I have a sort of a question to throw back at you, because one of the findings that we did see is that we see that participation in RRA interventions, and particularly in combinations of interventions, is associated with greater levels of livelihood diversification. And I wanted to know if that is a finding that makes sense or is consistent with your you know, sort of with your programming strategy. Over.
Thanks, Mark. Just very quickly. So when we looked at round 1 and round 2 and the data that came out of it, we used it really to inform our particularly year forward planning. And while we were trying our best to reach to scale, we kind of looked at scale from 2 lands. The first was, deepening the impact of in our interventions, like kind of crowding so many interventions around particular households. We kind of assumed at that point that that was likely to generate a positive impact on the household resilience, and gladly so. Your data shows that those households that participated in, let's say, several interventions have a stronger, sense in terms of improvement of their resilience. And the other side that we also assumed was to, expand this, the breadth of our scale, expanding to as many households as possible with some of the interventions that we do. And again, just speaking to the first one, I must say that the data that you presented resonates with us. It's not just our own confirmation biases, but we kind of I'd assumed we had created an hypothesis that crowding several interventions around a household in the Northeast would have this kind of impact, and I'm happy to see that the data is showing us a positive indicator. I don't know if that answers you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful, Jim. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. In the time that remains, I'd like to turn to your really interesting, important question, Nate, around kind of this relationship between assets and cash assistance, and who participates and who doesn't. So quickly, if we could turn to Mark or Gheda or Charles. I think it's an important question, one that we've spent quite a bit of time contemplating, and as well as other aspects of the study, something that we'd like to dig into more deeply. And Nate, feel free to unmute.
Yeah, just curious, given the time remaining, I won't go too long. I'll just turn it over to you, Gheda or Mark. I know, Mark, you kind of commented on this earlier, but I'm curious if you have any insights on the relationship between the cash aid and assets.
Yeah, I think Gheda, you can provide more detail here, but generally what we're finding is that sort of the pathway that we see is that participation in RRA interventions is associated with higher levels of diversification, of livelihood diversification, which in turn is associated with, sort of over time associated with higher levels of assets. So that's sort of that's kind of the causal pathway, at least that our findings indicate, as the way that participation in the market development interventions ultimately leads to higher levels of assets. Over.
Can I jump in here? This is Gheda. And so just to be clear on with the quantitative data, we don't see a relationship between cash aid and assets. I don't know if I heard you correctly, John. I believe you were specifically interested in the linkage between cash aid. How does cash assistance help bolster or support asset formation? That is largely a finding from the qualitative data. Just to be clear on that.
Hey, thanks, Gheda and Mark. And again, Nate, for that really important question, set of questions. In the minute that remains, I just want to thank everyone for participating today for the discussion. And we very much look forward to continuing to responding to your questions and to continue to dig into the data. This final slide offers just a summary of some of the main next steps. Chief among them is an in-person workshop with your core stakeholders in mid-January that we're currently planning with the objective of digging a little bit more deeply into some of these questions that you've raised around the RMS analysis, but also to ensure that in our third and final stage, which is a deeper qualitative inquiry, that we are filling in, core gaps in what we're understanding around dynamics in the Northeast with regard to the market systems development programming. That will kick off in March of next year. Meanwhile, we'll be working on developing the full synthesis of the recurrent monitoring survey analysis and learning briefs that we'll be sharing with you and various stakeholders with the intent that the findings here can be as useful as possible to inform program decisions going forward. So again, thank you very much. The final slide, and you know where to find us. A big thank you to our research partners. Again, Binomial Optimists Limited, Rural Resilience Activity, and those of you at REAL and USAID, both in DC and at the mission, who have helped us to carry out this work and offered your insights and questions as we go through this process together. So again, thank you very much. Oh, and a final note also, I'm reminded to make sure that I let you know we do have an evaluation. As always, we appreciate your feedback. So thank you. I think Karyn has popped that link into our chat box. And we'll be following up with the slides, as well as the link to that survey following this presentation. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.